it was easy to try to put this together because I had been asked about a year ago to write a textbook on nuclear policy fundamentals, and both civil and military. And the missing, or a missing chapter was, you guessed it, on arms control. And the reason it was missing is I couldn't think of anything that hadn't already been said, and I didn't think saying things over again was very interesting. So I thought about this, and this roughly, I hope, will be a part of the textbook. More important, as we'll see, I've been able to convey some of these ideas to people struggling to guide the Trump administration on these issues, and I think it has, well, we'll see, some traction. I don't want to oversell this. In fact, this is a proposition for you to consider even if the Trump administration doesn't consider it, okay? Because that latter possibility is quite real. On the other hand, the premise of this, as I explained to the Deputy National Security Advisor about 2 months ago, I said, you know, you might take a look at what Mr. Trump is doing. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, he's running for re-election. Did it ever occur to you that he might actually succeed? If he does, that means you have 7 years. And he's pushing quite an agenda for increasing the defense budget. You might need to be able to explain why we are doing all this. And this is part of that effort. All right. Let's start with this. Now, this occurred after I put this lecture together, but it was quite interesting. This was not that long ago, March 20th. What is it today? It was a little less than a month ago. He invited Putin to come to Washington to talk about, among other things, arms control. It says, we'll probably be meeting in the not too distant future to discuss the arms race, which is getting out of control. Now, I don't exactly know what he meant by that, but that's what he said. And he wanted everyone to know that he said that, which I think is interesting. Now, a lot of people, when this event occurred, said, yeah, well, Syria can't happen. We've annoyed Mr. Putin. There won't be talks. Also, we sanctioned Putin's operation by taking 60 of their diplomats and sending them home for what was reported to be the poisoning of some people in Great Britain. Does anybody know what happened today? See, this is the thing, you know. There's never a dull moment. Yes?
Did he back off of the sanctions?
Yes. He backed off the sanctions. He also, about, I think, 36 hours ago, let loose that he was not particularly impressed with being buffaloed into taking those 60 diplomats and sending them home. He thought that everyone was sending about 60 diplomats home, and he discovered the United States had sent more back than anybody else. He was livid. Now, why do those 2 points matter? Well, maybe this isn't an entire joke. We don't know. I mean, maybe Mr. Putin's coming, and maybe they're going to talk about the arms race, which is getting out of control. I wonder what we're going to talk about. Let's think about this, is what I suggested to the folks who are supposed to be responsible for this. All right, so 3 questions we're going to try to tackle. How has U.S. strategic force modernization and arms control been related to one another? Historically. Is there anything there that might suggest the future? Yeah? Second, there's something called the Nuclear Posture Review, which is done, once every 5 years or roughly. It's a statement of, well, why do we have these things? What is our policy regarding building them, limiting them, targeting them, blah, blah, blah. Well, we just came out with one of those earlier this year. So what is the relation of the Nuclear Posture Review and its use of something that was just mentioned, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and that case, which was something probably occurred a long time ago for a lot of you people. We're talking 1987. Now, I had the dubious distinction of being one of 2 people in the Senate that was asked to read the negotiating record of that treaty to try to understand better what it was about. So I have a little history on that one. In any case, it was a long time ago. But you know, what does the Nuclear Posture Review have to say about the INF Treaty as a model for arms control efforts for the future? And it does say something. We need to look at that. And then how might development of specific U.S. military programs, well, that really should be strategic military programs, be tied to future arms control initiatives? All right. If nothing else, a good thought exercise. All right. I really shouldn't be showing these. By the way, this is not how to use PowerPoint. So I'm going to look at this. I wish there was a way I could keep this from being seen, but I guess I can't.
It's a little late now.
A little late now. Ignore that screen. Listen to me. The short answer to number 1 is that in the past, every major U.S. strategic force modernization effort was tied actually to an arms control initiative, or at least an arms control outcome. In 1946, we wanted to have a monopoly of nuclear weapons in the world so that, get this, we could leverage the Soviets into agreeing never to get them. And this was the Atchison-Lilienthal report that later became the Baruch Plan. You might even read about it. Don't know. Can't say. This is a different course. I don't teach it. In the 50s, Eisenhower was the president for most of that decade. He proposed to have at least superiority and early and easy use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield and possibly for other purposes. It's called the New Look, and the idea was we're going to spend less on conventional defense and we're going to rely on nuclear weapons. In the end, luckily, he wasn't a big fan of use. But he at least got the defense budget down. He thought that this was a good thing. But he tied that to a number of incremental initiatives to get the Soviets to agree to a fissile material cutoff, to put a moratorium on testing, to try to use that dominance to get some movement towards limits. In the 60s and 70s, there was a very popular idea, which the Rand Corporation had a lot to do with, which is it's not clear that either side should ever strike first and think that it could get away with it without fearing that the other side would have something left in the way of nuclear weapons to strike second. Therefore, what we want to do is reach agreements to limit the ability to strike first, but assure that both sides could strike second on the assumption that, well, if both sides knew that they might be retaliated against, they wouldn't start working in. Harvard has a word for this. They always have a word for everything. Stability. Nice abstract thing that makes you look smart. You say that. And, oh, okay. And then in the Reagan and Bush years, and we're going to focus on this a bit more, and I think to some extent, in all fairness, Carter as well, President Carter. The aim was to compete to cap or close out strategic weapons competitions. And this included at least the INF Treaty, arguably START and something called SORT were part of this as well. Okay. So that was the short answer to number 1. Not so short. Now, as far as the INF Treaty being a model for Trumpian arms control, I think you could use it, and we'll get to that in a moment. The INF Treaty basically, and we'll learn more about this further in the lecture, threatened and went through with a threat to deploy certain missile systems in Europe that the Russians did not want. And the deal was, we're going to deploy these if you don't agree to get rid of your similar systems. But we can off-ramp and get rid of these systems. They're basically missiles that have nuclear warheads that can go 500 kilometers to 5,500. And we can agree to get rid of this whole class. It's up to you. That model, I think, could be tied to how we might see Trump do arms control. All right? And the reasoning for why Trump might do it will become very clear when you take a look at some documents that he's put his name on. Right? This is not just the projection of me, okay? Although it's got to at least be that, right? Right, okay. So investments in missiles that can go very quickly, you know, they're sometimes called prompt global strike systems, missiles that can fly at hypersonic speeds, could be tied to getting Russia, China, and others to agree to certain missile limits. Investments in something called boost phase defenses, missile defenses, could be tied to how violators of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty might be treated with regard to their right to have sovereignty over their airspace. Reducing nuclear warhead yields could be tied to agreements not to target cities, to reduce the prospect of people just murdering a lot of people just for the horrifying glory of it all. And investments to maintain the current levels of U.S. space control could be tied to developing rules with regard to self-defense and just how satellites of different countries should transit past one another and how frequently and how long.